All right, welcome to episode 34 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. His name is Glen Sharp. He's an analyst and editor at the California Energy Commission and lives in West Sacramento. He's a former professional boxer, and we're here to discuss his book, Punching from the Shadows, Memoir of a Minor League Professional Boxer. Welcome, Glen. Hey.
Welcome. Thanks very much for having me.
And thank you so much for coming on, Glenn. And so, guys, recently, about a few minutes ago, we were talking with Glenn about existentialism and particularly his ideas regarding the work of Viktor Frankl. And what's so cool is that Glenn and I found out that our views and our work together is pretty aligned. And so, which is obviously really cool for us because I feel man, Twitter has really created such a community for people where we really can just kind of come together and share ideas that a lot of us, a lot of the time already kind of have. So Glenn, the first thing I wanted to ask you, and again, just thank you so much for coming on, and I think just your work and your story is really profound. And so I wanted to ask you, in terms of success and failure, what do you feel like failure can teach us, and do you feel like it's ever possible to have success without it?
Uh, Me personally would say no, because I have that general thinking that suffering is the path to wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
and so you have to fail a little bit to grow a little bit, and success and victory really doesn't cause you to look within yourself because you're celebrating your success. You're not asking what went wrong, and so I think it sounds a little corny, but sometimes I say failure can be your friend. You just have to let it be your friend.
Yeah, and how so? How would that happen?
Well, you in the case of my story, I was really frustrated and I guess kind of broken in a bit by my failure. So my professional boxing record was 1-2. So my aspirations were far greater than my level of success, and that kind of broke me. And it took a good while to look into what happened and to admit to myself my participation in that failure. So if we're affected from others, there's not much you could do about that, but you could certainly look in the mirror and see uh, where we went wrong in our own experiences, and that's what this story was about. So I wrote the most of it kind of my short professional career, but then the last third of it is how I discussed approaching the failure and how I came to terms with it, and how ultimately that made me a healthier and better person.
Yeah. And what was it like for you initially? When you initially failed, what was it like for you to sort of? How did you kind of see it or conceptualize it?
I think uh, maybe this happens a lot for athletes and others, but I identified so much with my existence as a boxer, and that was my persona, and that was just my presence to the world. That when I was no longer a boxer and I no longer belonged to that club or brotherhood, I felt really alienated from everything, and as though I wasn't of much worth. And and it's difficult for people to be around someone who thinks so little of themselves in that way. So it took me a long time to build a life that that was of worth, or that I was proud of outside of boxing, and then I could come to terms with my boxing failure. So probably a lot of bigger time athletes go through a similar experience, just on a bigger, more public stage. Since I was, like the title of the book says, a minor league boxer, since my experience was not very public, just to my family and the people associated with me, it was on a much smaller scale, but probably the same story.
Yeah.
Yeah, and do you feel like you stuck all your chips into boxing, and that's kind of why when there was no boxing, you felt um, like that
Yeah.
that sense of failure and I don't want to say loss of purpose. I don't want to put words in your mouth or anything like that. But
Well,
without boxing, yeah.
what's the purpose? Is that's not putting words in my mouth, because I asked that question a lot.
Mm.
Like, um, I guess you could say I put all my chips into boxing. Um, Part of the problem was I guess I didn't have many chips, so I wasn't um, I wasn't as convicted as to committing myself to being the best boxer I could when I was young. And then when I began boxing as a professional, my failure to receive a better education, so to speak, really became clear. And so I was in over my head, and I felt I had to leave because unlike other sports, you could be a bad baseball player or a bad tennis player, and you don't get damaged. But if you're a bad boxer, you're getting hurt all the time. And so I realized I couldn't continue with that, and so I was ashamed of myself. But all I ever thought of myself was as a boxer, and so it took me a long time to realize I could have a good purpose in life outside of boxing, and it took me to do that in order to come to understand my history in boxing.
You know what? I remember reading in the book earlier on in the book when you first wanted to pursue boxing, your dad definitely was not into the idea.
Right,
He was more about you, getting an education because he wanted you to have something that he didn't have.
right.
But you know what's funny? When I was reading that part in the book and how you wanted to pursue it and how you were kind of like pushing for it anyway, it's weird. I get what the end result was, but it almost seemed like it still was the right thing to do, like to try to do what it was that was, that creative pursuit. I agree. I see what you're saying when you're saying like maybe you're saying you didn't fully commit to it in the training and we'll talk about later. But that initial thing of like wanting to do what you're inspired to do. Do you think that was still the right impulse or?
Yeah. So I have no problems with what I did, and I think my father even came to understand. A person is going to do what they're going to do, and it's even the same with say personal relationships. People love who they're going to love, and someone on the outside could say, no, don't get involved with this person. It's not going to be good. But you can't stop you loving who you love or what you love. And so I really love boxing. And so my life is more complete because of that experience. It was a harsh experience, and it helped to make me the person that I am today. And so it was well worth the effort, well worth the pain, I would say.
Yeah. And Glenn, what was your start like in boxing? How did you become interested in it?
Um, I remember the first fight I remember watching with my father was the Bob Foster Dick Tiger light heavyweight fight. I think that was probably about 1967 or so, 68. I was 9 years old, so I mean, I can't explain why I fell in love with boxing, but I just did. From that moment, I said, "Man, I would like to do that." But I grew up in a household that didn't stress boxing, and even in the locales we lived in the Midwest, there were no boxing programs, so I had no chance to develop as a boxer until I moved to Sacramento here in California when I was 20 years old, which is kind of late for a boxer or an athlete of any sport to begin. But that I just came to it's called the Capitol Boxing Gym here in uh, in Sacramento, and that's where I began training. And your boxing gyms are really weird, unique experiences because you could have the greenest novice training in the same gym with world ranked contenders, and that was what happened here in California. It's just a really unique experience.
And when did you know you wanted to become a boxer or professionally?
I think by the time I was a teenager, I said, man, if I ever get a chance to do that, I'm going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really didn't develop physically till I was older, probably about 17 or 18. And then once that happened and I filled out a little bit, I said, God, I got to find a way to box somehow. And so fortunately, I ended up in California here where I could apply myself.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting to me. When you were learning boxing before you filled out in high school, there was this, I remember reading you. There's this. You had a style that was like for somebody who weighed 170-ish pounds, but
Yeah.
until you actually grew up to that like amount, that's like when
Yeah.
you actually start to feel like that balance while fighting, which is that was interesting to me. It's like as if like you maybe you didn't know, but it's like as if your body knew before that age, like how you were gonna be fighting, and then you kind of grew into it.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Well, there's a whole lot of our life that goes on that we're not aware of, and so I think my body or my conscience knew what was going on, even though I consciously did not know what was going on, and so I was kind of developing for what I was going to be, although I didn't know why that was happening.
And Glenn, so sometimes people, especially when their identity becomes intertwined with either a particular profession, when it comes to let's say sometimes even relationships or a particular relationships or a particular relationship, right? They tend to kind of this sort of the idea or the obsession is intertwined with perfectionistic thinking, where it's like if this is part of your, or rather the only part of your identity, you feel like you have to be perfect at it because it's pretty much the thing that defines who you are as a person generally. So have you ever struggled with perfectionistic thinking when you were boxing? Did you feel like at some point,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
your fights had to be perfect?
right. So I remember feeling that after my first professional fight, which I won by decision. Instead of celebrating that, I was so hard on myself because I just going through everything that I did wrong, and I said a really good fighter would have taken care of this easier. I was really really hard on myself and not just accepting the bit of success that I had, and so. As I've gotten older, you hear about that, you read about that, where people are striving for the sense of perfectionism, and we're never going to reach that. And it's really self sabotaging. You're just limiting yourself when you think that way, and instead of just accepting the good that comes your way.
Yeah.
And a good contrast to that is Yaqui Lopez, the guy that I was a sparring partner for,
Mm-hmm.
and who was a great light heavyweight. He just had, well, I felt it at the time, but as 30 years later, I could see that I was right. He just had the healthiest and best attitude about boxing and competition in that sense, in that, you prepare as well as you can. And then when you enter the contest, and it's really out of your hands. You just do what you can, and if you win, you win, and if you lose, you lose. That's not the big deal. The big deal is that you committed yourself to winning. What happens is rather irrelevant,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And his healthy perspective in that way was a contrast to my sense of perfectionism.
Yeah. Did you guys ever get a chance to talk about it at that time? The sort of conflicting attitudes you had about boxing?
No, so I don't think I could have articulated any type of thinking like that at the time. So we didn't talk that way.
Mm.
But it would be really interesting now, because I see him every once in a while. Um, it would be nice to meet with him and talk about things like this, because Yaki is not someone who's going to go out and express his emotions so openly, but he has a lot of profound thoughts about the experience of boxing, and of course he competed at such a high level that he could speak about people who lived at a stratified level in boxing. So I think I'm going to try to do that with him
Yeah.
sometime.
That'd be really cool to see what you learn from him.
Yes.
And then okay, so my next question, and you obviously, if you feel uncomfortable answering it, that's absolutely okay because it's a little bit more personal. So when it comes to perfectionistic thinking, usually the sort of identity that's intertwined with it, whether let's say it's becoming a doctor, becoming a lawyer, in this case becoming a boxer, becoming a professional, anything. So a lot of times, I mean, it just happens to be that that person chose that particular profession. That the perfectionism itself, what the underlying issue is. It's not necessarily not being the best at your profession, right? Again, whatever that happens to be. So, did you ever feel like for you it was a way that, let's say if your thinking was that let's say I got the I guess the thinking, and if the goal was that for me to become the best boxer, let's say in the world or in the country or whatever it is, do you feel like whether you knew it then or you maybe accept it now, whether for you it was a way for you to feel accepted, worthy, and lovable?
Uh, yeah, that's kind of hard to admit,
Yeah.
but I think there's some truth to that. That thought I would be more worthy of a person if I were a successful boxer, and I don't understand why that's the case, and I really can't explain that. And I think that's why failing a boxing how I did was so hard on me, because I thought that's how I was going to be, accepted by the world, so to speak, and that's what a good part of the healthy work that comes with dealing with my failure is you find out you're a worthy person, whether you're a good boxer or a good doctor or whatever anyway, and that's the work that we need to do on ourselves as people.
Yeah.
And how did you deal with fear throughout your career? Like, because when I was reading through the book, there are actually many times like you'd be talking about certain philosophers like Ortega y Gasset or Harrigal's view on fear, and you related that to boxing. What's your philosophy on fear?
Uh, I have a general idea that the human body or the human person was constructed to feel fear on a regular basis,
Mm-hmm.
and we've we've constructed a society where, for the most part, or at least say here in the United States of America, for the most part, you could go without having to be fearful, like physically fearful, for all of your life, and I think that creates some problems for people because we're meant to feel fear every once in a while, and maybe boxing is a way for that need to be filled because it's just natural to feel fear when someone is going to uh, try to knock you unconscious, or hit you, and I think that's part of one of the attractions of boxing for people is that it allows them to express this need to feel fear, and it's really uncomfortable at first. Like I talked about in my first amateur fight, I was so scared, I thought I was going to pee myself right before it started. I was so scared. But after a while, you realize that hollowness in your stomach and the butterflies are natural. And once you learn to direct that fear a little bit, it makes you a sharper, more aware competitor. And so uh, we kind of live in a world where we're taught that fear is a bad thing or fear is something that you don't want to know, when actually I think it leads to a heightened uh, sense of experience and a heightened life.
Yeah.
And there's a surfer. I think his name is Laird Hamilton, one of those guys who surfs those mega waves all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he expressed something similar to that. He said the human being was made to be afraid, and the way that I fulfill that need is by surfing big waves.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to get scared, regularly. And when I read that, I said I understand that exactly.
Yeah, wow. So what are the most like I guess profound experiences that I've ever had was I remember watching I don't know Glenn if you've seen it. They recently HBO did a documentary on Muhammad Ali's life, so it was a two-part series. And so the way that it started off was that it was pretty much Muhammad Ali behind the scenes talking about pretty much how terrified he was behind every match, or let's say before every match. And so with Muhammad, he said that like he's like people tend to think of me as like this really sort of big guy, right, who's never afraid and who kind of comes out of night after night and who sort of puts on this great performance. But he's like the thing is I am terrified between and then before every match. That for me, he's like I always think about the things that I could lose because he's like the life of a boxer is that where you pretty much if you lose one fight that can actually send your career down a drain. So for me, that was like really great because I was like, wow. So if Muhammad Ali is one of these people who can be terrified about things that are important to him, that means it would be okay for me to feel the same way too.
Yeah, so I hadn't seen that documentary yet, so I'm going to watch it. But that's true. When you're young and first boxing, you don't understand that everyone else is scared just like you. You think you're scared, and this guy looks like he's ready to go to a party,
Mm-hmm.
but he's trembling too.
Yeah.
And it's only a little later with some experience you realize everyone is scared just the same. And anyone who says they're not scared is either lying or there might be maybe saying that the fear is not getting the best of me, but they still feel it. And it's interesting what you say about Ali admitting that he felt fear. I think that drove a lot of the antics that he did, like when he would taunt Joe Frazier and all when he would make all those poems when he was younger. He
Yeah.
was That's how he was kind of venting the discomfort of his fear. And he when he was getting ready to fight Frazier all three times, he knew how hard that was going to be, and I think he was just trying to bluff himself through the fear because it's a daunting experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And like grandiosity and or anger is pretty much it's a way for you to cope or anybody to cope with
Yes,
fear. Mm-hmm.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so for you, in terms of like, I know obviously the way we kind of understand or conceptualize perfectionism is obviously usually as a bad thing, and it definitely has a really dark and unhealthy side. But I wonder for you, Glenn, in terms of fear and perfectionism, how do you feel like both of those ideas, or I mean, I guess both of those not goals, but both of those sort of concepts helped you in your fights?
Uh, well, I probably was not really experienced enough to use my fear
Mm-hmm.
to the highest degree, but I was progressing on that. So, uh, I think you're right about the idea of perfectionism, and it's got a positive side and a negative side.
Mm-hmm.
Because the desire to be better is what drives us to improve,
Yep.
or to invent and to create. So there's got to be a healthy balance between constantly wanting to improve oneself and then not condemning oneself because you fail to achieve that level of perfection, because I think we're always going to envision a higher level of performance than we're capable of delivering,
Mm-hmm.
and you just have to learn to accept that you could still have performed admirably without being perfect.
Yeah,
And,
it's. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
and so that's just it takes at least in my experience, it takes a while to learn how to balance that perfectionist drive.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, like for example, if you're too down on yourself from being too perfectionistic, it might stop you from taking more action, and to have more
Yeah.
of a long term scope of what it is that you're pursuing, and maybe not to get down on yourself is what'll let you get much better at that thing. Even though, from that perfectionist mindset, it's like it's counterintuitive. You think like, oh no, if I was better at this, I would have done well. But if you take the other kind of thinking on a long term approach, you'll get better anyway,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yes.
you'll be able to
Yes.
have
Yeah.
a balance, like a healthy balance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, very nuanced.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And I wanted to also ask, what was it about about Hegel's philosophy that really stuck out to you? I know I asked before, like, what about the philosophy like spoke to you, but I remember like reading not specifically the Hegel part, actually the Ortega y Gasset. There's this part where you talked about that balance between the contemporary life and a creative pursuit, and how you sort of like you drew off of his philosophy to kind of how you went about living your life, and what exactly like about his philosophy spoke to you.
Well, it was very interesting. I could talk for a long, long time about this, but Lo, it's related to what I said before. In our contemporary society, we've created this existence that's so, at least physically, safe for most of us, and comfortable. Where in our earlier stages of our existence, we had to hunt and fish and farm in order just to exist. And then we've created this world where none of that is necessary, but so many of us spend our leisure time hunting, fishing, and gardening. So we do for fun exactly what we used to have to do just to stay alive. So there's something just innately rooted in us, and that to live in our earlier stages of our cultural development. And I think that's kind of related to what you were just talking about, the perfectionism a little bit, and that you choose this task that you're drawn to, which connects you to our earlier roots in life, and you don't have to do it perfectly. What you just have to do is commit yourself so strongly to it, which is what Hegel stressed for me, and that the goal is not to hit the bullseye with in archery. The goal is not to hit the bullseye with the arrow. The goal is not to need to aim, and that's sometimes hard to come to understand. You certainly, on your first reading and your first applications of this thinking, you don't quite get it. So it's you don't want to try to be perfect, but you become perfect more by not trying, and
Hmm. Hmm.
that takes some work to come to that level of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those two philosophers are in my mind are pretty connected. So we guess it stresses that we in our pre-literate stage of cultural evolution, still engaged in all these creative activities or creative activities that were related to our very existence. And then Herrigel takes it to a real aesthetic, highly, in my mind, highly developed philosophical principle. So reading those guys really helped me uh, both understand my failure in boxing and how I was developing as a person.
And what would you say are the sources of your failure in boxing the first time around?
Um, well, pragmatically, not committing myself to having as complete a boxing education as I should have. So,
Mm-hmm.
like in Harrigel's case, he says you have to practice and practice and practice,
Yeah.
and that's a pragmatic bit. You're also kind of reaching for some divine type of level of talent, but that comes from actually just doing the physical work. So I didn't do as much physical work as I needed to be prepared to be a professional boxer. And then I wasn't willing, once I found out what a difficult situation I was in, I wasn't willing to make the commitment to stay to become as good as I can. Then I just kind of cut and ran. And that's what hurt me so bad, because uh, I I wasn't the person that I thought that I was,
Yeah.
and that's a part of healing from your failures. You have to be in order to be authentic, you have to be sincerely honest with yourself about where you came up short,
Mm-hmm.
and that was kind of the difficult part of writing the book, because I had to honestly, I'm just look in the mirror and say, you fell short here and here and here, and I wasn't condemning myself for that. I was just being as objective as possible. And once you accept that about yourself, you see, geez, I'm I'm a I'm a better person for wearing that scar.
Yeah. And what's really tough about perfectionism, and probably one of the more difficult parts of it, is that a lot of times, in order for people, because they do feel like they have to live up to that ideal that they have in their minds, a lot of times what they do is they actually don't put in full effort. Because this way, I mean, it's easy to tell yourself, well, if I failed,
Yes,
I mean, I could have done better if I really
right.
wanted it. And yet, what actually happens is like the person is still devastated regardless.
Right, and so that's that form of self-protectionism,
Yeah.
but you're just harming yourself with that type of thinking, and it's much healthier to be willing to fail. So that's I go back to Yaqui again. He was always willing to fail, and that wasn't that as important to him as having tried as sincerely as possible.
Yeah.
It's it's I mean that's why he's today, man, he still receives fan letters. He hasn't fought for close to 40 years, and he still receives fan letters from all over the world, and people, I think, could sense how sincere and authentic of a person he was, and that was a function of how he fought.
Yeah.
It's really kind of beautiful.
Yeah, and what's so cool to me, Glenn, is the fact that so before we started filming, Glenn and I were talking about Viktor Frankl and his ideas of authenticity, and Glenn told me he actually was reading one of my tweets about it, which I thought was really cool because it's like, wow, Glenn Sharp is reading my tweets about Viktor Frankl. So what I thought was really interesting was that, Glenn, you said before that authenticity to you is also an important concept, especially when we sort of look at it in the context of failure. So how do you feel like the sort of idea of, let's say, the person as you are or the authentic self, how can that help you in some way overcome failure or the fear of failure?
Well, I think you know yourself better when you're developed your level of authenticity. So when I was a younger man, attracted to boxing, I saw myself, as kind of a tough guy,
Mm-hmm.
and someone who didn't need to whine or cry about life, and would just kind of bust through anything that got in my way. And then I found out I couldn't do that, and that was kind of devastating. I mean, I couldn't have articulated this when I was 23 or 4 years old, but I was kind of devastated to realize that this persona that I had created of myself was actually an illusion, and it took me a long time to like throw away the broken mask and realize and try to look at what was really existing, and then develop that. And that's how you, in my experience, that's how you become authentic, by getting rid of your false mask or your false personas and looking at the person that you really are. And then and then you have to come to accept that, and I guess you could say even love yourself for what you are. And it's not easy, but then that helps you to understand your situation much better. And so for the remainder of my life, say it's been close to 30 years now after come to terms with how what my authentic being is, uh, you just know yourself so much better. So when you're confronted with some situation that could upset your equilibrium, you know what you are and you know what you're supposed to do, and that helps you do what you're going to do. And I, I hate to sound like some one of those life coaches or something like that, but it's true. Once you come to understand yourself much better, uh, it makes navigating through life a much easier process.
And do you feel like for you that you chose authenticity over perfection?
Yes, I never looked at it that way, but I think that's true. So in the second half of my life, I've kind of aspired to be a writer, and I've trained myself to be a writer, and I'm not uh, I'm not bothered by perfectionism. I'm not uh, I'm not trying to write something that the world is going to say, "Oh, this is the greatest thing ever written." I just want to write something that's true to myself, and that's good enough for me. So I think it's a better balance of the perfectionism. I try to write as well as I can and be as honest as I can, and maybe even be a little bit entertaining. But at the same time, all I could do is what I could do, and that's good enough. Because
And what's so.
like Al,
Mhm, go ahead.
I was going to say, like that Al Franken line he had on Saturday Night Live. Like I can't even remember, but
From the mirror, right?
yeah, yes,
Yeah, yeah.
yes.
What's the line?
So
I love myself. I'm happy with like something like that.
Uh-huh.
He would say like really affirming things to
Uh-huh.
the mirror
yeah,
back to himself. I wish I
I
remember the
got you.
line. It was
Okay.
funny.
yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, but that's the point. He's saying I'm worthy of being loved even by myself. And it was funny when he did it, but it's very, very true for people.
Yeah.
I'm
What's so interesting is that so I think like as obviously as kids and even a little later we develop like these really shitty coping mechanisms for life, and so perfectionism is definitely one of them because in our minds we definitely believe that in some way that if we're perfect we're going to be loved. But I mean like now I can tell you, Glenn, like with having you on our show, the thing that's like I'm sure this is the case for Alan as well. The thing that's drawing me to you is the fact that through your authenticity I get to learn from you. And so from my perspective is that like if you let's say you were perfect, I'm not. I mean, I'm sure I could learn some things from you, obviously, but I don't think they would be as impactful as the conversation that we're having now, which is literally teaching. I think the both of us in terms of how to accept ourselves, or about how to accept ourselves and love ourselves.
Yeah. So like there's and you were just talking about it before, where you learn to accept yourself. Uh, when you were 23 or 24, no, I think it was 23 in the book. It was like right after college, and your dad would see you around, hanging out with friends and stuff like that. And there was this. I'm probably not saying it exactly as you said in the book, but it was like a time of desperation or like trying to find something to do, um, because you kind of saw how he would see you, and that feedback like messed with your head at the time. And I could really relate to that. Like right after college, I was not doing like the traditional path. I was also kind of like hanging around with friends. Had trouble getting like the job I was supposed to have, and anything like that.
yeah,
And that could really, really mess with your head. It's also a really good teaching experience, but yeah, when you don't have all that like taken care of at that time, that could. I remember for a long time, like personally, I was definitely depressed during that time. Um, for you, so you answered it already, but pretty much what happened is like you reflected on that, right? And you were able to kind of still pursue boxing anyway, and then eventually get that first professional fight, and your dad met. And I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Is it Bobo Nelson, or is it
Bo-
Bobo?
Bobo Olson.
Bobo Olson. Wow, I'm sorry about that. Bobo Olson. Yeah, so when he met Bobo Olson, and then he actually like shook his hand, he was all happy to meet him, and I'm sure like
Yeah.
for you that was a good moment because like up until then, it didn't seem like your dad appreciated what it was that you were trying to do.
Yeah, so I think that's true. That day when my father met Bobo was kind of a like an act of affirmation from him, because I said, "Geez, he's not thinking so badly about me boxing now." And it's funny, because my dad was not an openly emotional person, and uh, he kept his feelings fairly guarded. And so that's one of the few times that he was just openly unguarded in his, joy meeting Bobo, who was a big hero of his when they were young. And so I said, my gosh, I mean, I wish I had a camera at the time. It was something.
Yeah. So, like moments like that, especially like when you were trying for a long time to do this one particular thing, and things aren't going right, and it's like these weird phases where like he couldn't see what it is that you're doing, like leading up to that. That's a big moment. Like a lot of people do things off of faith when they're pursuing what it is that they're interested in, and a lot of people in the beginning, they don't know what it is that you're up to, because it's kind of like you kind of get it yourself.
Yes,
And
yes,
it's definitely rough to deal with, like all these people telling you what you should do and what you gotta be and what
yes,
you gotta
yeah,
do. Sometimes it's right, or it's coming from the right place, but because they don't know what it is that you're trying to really do, a lot of
yes,
times it's like the wrong advice.
Yeah.
So
yes. It's a difficult time because, like you said, people are telling you what to do, but they're not you, so they can't really know for sure. And even when you're young, was the case for me, you're just so confused about your options and your possibilities, you don't even know what you're supposed to do, and it's kind of a frustrating time to just ferret through to figure out what you're going to do with your life. And I don't. Did you guys ever see the movie The Graduate?
Yes.
Like, so the famous line in that, so Dustin Hoffman's character has graduated from college and he's just kind of wasting through time. And some guy says, plastics, you need to get into plastics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's this perfect business type sense coming from all these very affluent business people. But that was just not what that guy, Dustin characters or Hoffman's character had in mind. He goes, plastics, what the hell? I'm not doing that.
yeah.
And what did your dad want for you?
I think he would have liked me to be a professional person, to be a lawyer or something like that, or to really get an advanced education. And I came to realize in retrospect that he would have liked the opportunity to be educated, but life that wasn't possible for him when he was younger. And so what he kind of lived the educational life through me, and I probably rebelled against that for a bit, which is kind of another natural story along human beings. But
Mm-hmm.
your parents offer you something, and well, if that's what my parents want, I definitely don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's uh, that was a coming together story that took a long time too, but we finally did.
And did you ever feel like through boxing you were fighting for his affection in some way? Or acceptance, at least?
No, because I knew how I could have gotten his acceptance was to say just go straight to graduate school or go to law school or something,
Mm-hmm.
and but I thought that would have been false to myself, but it would have made him very, very happy. So I wasn't going to do that at the time,
Yeah.
and it was frustrating for him because my two best friends in high school were living the life that you just mentioned. They were doing the right thing. So one friend went to law school immediately from graduating from college, and my other friend got married and got a job and bought a house and started a family.
Mm-hmm.
And so of the three of us, there's me just kind of putzing around, just trying to have some fun day to day and not building any kind of life. And so I think my father saw my friends making a life for themselves, and he said, "What's the matter with my kid, man?"
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that's definitely rough. That's definitely rough at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was the time period like for you between the time that you, let's say, ended boxing the first time around and then went back to it?
I stopped boxing in the winter of 1983, like about January, February of '83, and well, I always went to the gym, so I never really stopped working out, but I was just kind of goofing off of that. And the ending part of the book where I was told that I probably shouldn't box anymore was 1990.
Hmm.
So I think I really began applying myself again in about 87 and started training full time again.
Hmm.
And so it was in 1990 when that kind of ended. So I was 32 years old,
Yeah.
and and uh, and that's what led me to writing because I realized then, oh, I've got to do something with my life now. But I had done enough, I guess you could say, work on myself, or I understood myself enough better that I wasn't um, hurt or damaged by being told I couldn't box anymore because I had made as sincere a commitment as I could, and I had done all that I could, and so uh, that wasn't good enough. That was fine with me. So I think that's a good point where you realize maybe your perfectionism balance is at a healthy point because I was sad that that life had ended, but I wasn't wounded by it that time because I had done all that I could and it just didn't work out, and I was fine with that.
Yeah. And you also chose authenticity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, and yeah, there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah.
It's good. I'm gonna read Frankel's book now. So no,
Oh,
so I'm reading your tweet. So I'm gonna get Frankel's book.
yeah, Frankel's book is pretty. So, in terms of like the existentialist, Frankel's really good, and also Rollo May. So, Frankel wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and Rollo May wrote Man's Search for Himself. So, I think when it comes to authenticity, Rollo May is kind of the better person to read because like Frankel's more about finding purpose and meaning. Even though I mean the concepts are always intertwined, but I think Rollo May is the better writer when it comes to sort of being your authentic self and what that even looks like.
So I've read 4 or 5 of May's books, and
Oh,
they helped me a lot.
oh,
And so I agree. He was quite a writer.
oh, that's so cool. Which ones were your favorites?
I the, there was one with myth in the title, like the
Yes,
search for
yes,
and
the cry for myth. Yeah.
cry for myth,
Hmm.
and then he wrote one about anxiety, which was very informative to me.
Yeah.
And he was a great writer.
Yeah,
Great.
we had Kirk Schneider on the show last week, who was a collaborator with Rollo May.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah, that was so cool.
I will watch that now.
Yeah, that was really cool to have met him and to have talked to him. And so, like, I mean, existential ideas are so awesome because I feel like, well, I mean, not even I feel like it's true. They pretty much they're predominant to everyone. That's what makes them so cool. I think all of us struggle with perfectionism and authenticity, and especially kind of like what that internal battle is, and sort of trying to find out what it is that'll actually make us happy.
It's it's not something that we're given as a birthright. It's something that you have to work for during the course of your life, and it's a struggle, but it's a struggle that's well worth it.
Yeah, absolutely.
In your last professional fight, now I know how that went, but question, how would you still have sized yourself up at the time? Because like you trained a lot for that for last fight with Lewis, for Joe Lewis,
Yes,
and
yes.
like how would you? I know that he did. Okay, so actually a little background. He didn't make weight as he contractually should have for that fight.
Uh-huh.
So like technically you could have not have taken the fight, but how would you still say like you feel like you performed against him, or how he did in the match?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm sorry. The weight problem that I had was in my second fight with a guy
Oh,
named
with
Mike
Hutchinson?
Hutchinson. Yes.
Sorry.
Okay. No, that's right. And um, I think from an objective sense, you could say that I could have been in the locker room when I found out that the guy had not cut weight like I had and said, no, I'm not going to do that. But you you're kind of in a state of mind. You're not thinking in any rational, reasoned way because you're preparing to fight, which is kind of an irrational act when you don't have to do it. So that's why you're supposed to have a manager to look out for you to say, no, this is not going to happen. So I think I was pretty well prepared to fight, but I was just too weak to to do so. And I guess we just won't know. I was so depleted. And it's just you hear stories today about people really damaging themselves trying to make white or trying to become dehydrated and they end up in the hospital. And it's uh, it's just kind of sad. I feel it for people who go through that because I know exactly what that's like.
And so, I mean, I guess one of the most important questions that we can ask here is going to be, so Glenn, what was it like to, first of all, prepare for it and then to fight literally one of the greatest boxers of all time, Joe Louis?
No, oh, well, his name was Joe Louis, but this was a different Joe Louis. He was not
Oh!
the great Joe Louis,
Oh! My
but
mistake.
the name is the same. It was kind of funny because when I told people I was fighting Joe Louis, they said,
Yeah.
"Oh man, you're gonna get killed."
Wow. Okay. I'm sure you've
So
heard this pretty much your entire life, then, or most of
yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah.
So who is that Joe Louis?
So he was from San Jose, and not nearly as good as the real Joe Louis, but
Yeah.
still good enough to beat me. So
Yeah.
uh, I don't know what really happened to him. He didn't achieve much in boxing himself either. So that's what happened. There's so many boxers who compete at the lower preliminary rounds
Yeah.
that no one hears of them except family members or some friends,
Hmm.
and it's kind of like minor league baseball players. No one has ever heard of the guys who made it to AAA baseball but didn't get beyond to the major leagues, and that's kind of the club that I was circling with.
I got you. Well, what do you feel like some of the most important life lessons of boxing are? Like, what are the ones that, I guess, what are the most important life lessons that you've learned from boxing?
Uh, in retrospect, it's come around. It's kind of like the Stoics, where you learn not to expect a whole lot,
Hmm.
and you can't complain when things are not going your way, because during the course of a fight, things are regularly not going to be going your way,
Hmm.
and you, uh, again, it come to me with retrospect, but you learn not to get too upset when things are going bad or too elated when things are going really well, because the pendulum is going to swing back, and you you kind of put things in context. So now I've worked for the state government here in California for over 30 years, and sometimes you're around people that get excited or frustrated because a deadline is, we're kind of pushing a deadline and people are getting upset. And I said, this is not anything to get upset about, really. In the big context of things, you're going to go home and eat your dinner and come back tomorrow, and it will be all right. And so I don't want to say boxing is always a life or death matter, but it's a dangerous activity in which you could get hurt or sometimes killed. So once you have engaged in that a little bit, you don't get upset too much about other things in life, because you realize you're still gonna eat and go to bed and get up, and it's gonna be all right.
Yeah. And in your book, you wrote that boxing was pretty much for you a case study, or I guess, yeah, I mean, that's a good term for it, a case study in resource management in terms of economic theory. What did you mean by that?
Well, I explained a little bit about how a boxer is always balancing what he wants with what he wants costs.
Hmm.
So you don't want to be too offensive minded, because then you leave yourself open defensively for the other person. So you're always kind of trading off your offensive capacity and your defensive capacity, and sometimes you have to trade that off. Your trade-off depends on who you're fighting, and sometimes it even occurs throughout the fight, where you're a little more tired, or you could sense your opponent's a little tired, and so you're always balancing the costs and the benefits, and that's what all your decision making is. And boxers are not articulating this, or not even consciously thinking in this, but that's what's going on underneath all their decision making that's occurring in a fight. And so a lot of people think that there's no thinking that goes on in a boxing match, and it's just two guys go out there windmilling fists, and that's not the case. There's
Yeah.
a lot of thinking that's going on, and a lot of emotional thinking, and then a lot of more cerebral objective thinking. And it's to me, that's the attraction of boxing anymore. So I don't really get that interested in, I mean, sometimes I really just get interested in the fight as a sporting event, but a lot of times I just watch it as a drama, because I like to think about what each guy is going through, say emotionally at the time, or what he's thinking and trying to do. And that's what the interesting part of boxing is for me. It's it's not so much a sporting activity anymore.
Yeah.
Huh. And like I guess when you're watching the way they move and how they're fighting each other, that's that like from your experience, that's how you could kind of tell where they're at in
Yes.
their head.
Yeah. So a lot of times I could tell, say, a guy could be moving in a certain way and 30 seconds later be moving a little differently. And I could tell what's happening. Either he got a little intimidated or maybe he's becoming a little more confident now. And I guess that comes from experience from having seen so much of it. But that's the interesting part for me. It's like watching a play. There's a drama going on, and you try to understand the backstory, and that's what's neat about boxing for me now.
Yeah. And Glenn, what do you think about the quote from Rocky where he says the real battle is the one against yourself, that it's actually you against you?
That is it. That that
Yeah.
that is it. So, uh, and I think I mentioned something like that in the book, like you're actually physically fighting another guy,
Mm-hmm.
but in reality, the real fight is with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's just to get out there, but it's also the fight is making those cost and benefit decisions about what's going on and what you need to do. But that's it.
Yeah.
And probably that's it in life all the time. The real struggle is with yourself, right? Like you might have relationship troubles, but if you really want to think about it, the the struggle is with you and how you're facing the relationship, and
Yeah.
it's not always comfortable to struggle with yourself, but that's what ultimately life is, I think.
Yeah. And that. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go on, go on.
Sometimes you think like it's some, for example, in a relationship, you think it's something somebody else did. Then sometimes
Yeah.
it's just like your interpretation of what they did. It's not like the
Yes.
real reality. You might be projecting something,
Yep.
and like
Yes.
you have to catch these things this way you know like what's you versus what's really them. Or and sometimes you find out it's not them at all, and then that changes things as if it's
Yes.
like in an early part in the relationship, which
Absolutely.
is good. Yeah. So.
And so, like the beauty of whatever. I'm not, maybe beauty's not the right term, but whatever. I guess the way projection is, even though in some way it is pretty beautiful, is that projection can actually be both. Let's say, it could both be symbolic and it could be real at the same time. So what I mean by that is that let's say you can perceive that someone is rejecting you, or the other person could be rejecting you still, but it's still a projection of your own inadequacy. Mm-hmm. So it's like, let's say if you get broken up with, right? It might actually be that the person, or not. That's a bad example. Let's say if somebody says, well, I don't know, I'm not interested in spending time with you tonight because of whatever reason. And in your mind, it could be that, oh my God, this person, this girl, like she doesn't want anything to do with me. She doesn't love me. She thinks that I'm unworthy, right? So it could actually be that those things are true, right? But the thing is, from that information, you don't know that.
You don't
so
know.
yeah,
Right.
it could just happen to be that that's true, but you were actually you didn't have enough information to make that.
She could just
assessment.
be busy.
Right, or
And she's willing to do another day, but she just didn't say it. So then you thought this whole thing, and you took it down a different path.
Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
then so what she says that like pretty much I'm not able to spend time with you. Yeah, so it could be that she's just busy and you're just projecting your inadequacies onto her when it's an actual where the I guess reality of it isn't a good fit. But the thing is sometimes projections do fit. And so what I think was so important about that Rocky quote was that, from my kind of interpretation and understanding of it, is that essentially it's always about your projections. Whether your projections fit with the reality or they don't, what matters is not so much whether or not you lose, and what matters is not so much whether or not you get broken up with, or whether somebody doesn't want to spend time with you. It's literally the way you interpret those things in the context of how you see yourself. And so when Rocky
Yes.
says that it's,
Yes.
yeah, and so I think the kind of life battle, if we could chalk it up to anything, is one where we try to sort of accept and love ourselves despite all of the garbage that happens to us. Which is why I think like Viktor Frankl had that quote where he said pretty much it's not the sort of circumstances that matter, but it's really your internal reaction. Because the idea is that if you don't personalize what happens to you, right? So if you can sort of see yourself as a sort of genuine and authentic and positive and good human being, that what really matters and what's important at bottom is not what happens to you again, but it's pretty much the person you decide to become despite what happens, or even because of what happens.
Yeah.
Right? So the
Yeah.
idea is that self-love is really sort of at core of what we're all looking for.
I got to read that book, man.
Yeah.
You know, since you quoted Rocky, I want to ask, you met Stallone, right?
Yeah, but I mean, for like 30 seconds, I mean, a minute or something, not very long.
Yeah.
Well, what would you, anyway, just from kind of like seeing how he moves around, all that, I guess interacts with you, what would you think of him anyway? Was that for Rocky, by the way, that he was doing his,
No, he was in the business of promoting fights for a while. So I met him in 1982. I think what Rocky came out in 76. So he was at the peak of Sylvester Stallone, the actor, period. You know, like he was the big man on campus, and he knew it. And I'm not dogging him for that, but I mean he was kind of regal, you know, and he just kind of had this air about him that was different from anyone else in the room. It was really kind of different.
Mm.
And you know, I mean, I liked the first Rocky. I didn't care too much for the others after that, but it's just different. I had never been around any like a mega celebrity like that before, and it was just a kind of an air about him. It was just kind of unique. And now you look back, and everyone wants a picture taken with him, and everyone wants to talk to him for 10 seconds so they could go home and tell somebody they talked to. So Sylvester, and it's his people like that, their time is not their own so much. Just whenever they're in some public place, the public is just trying to latch onto them. And I was thinking, God, how uncomfortable of a life that would be to just
Yeah.
always have someone wanting to peck on you like that. And so he was pretty patient with us. I think he had a pretty good regard for boxers, so he tolerated us pretty well. But man, I think it would be hard being a celebrity.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
So I learned something interesting with celebrities, because they actually don't like so much. I mean, they don't mind taking the occasional photo and stuff like that. But you're right. There's this thing where that's kind of their whole life, and they want to just like be around somebody who's just like normal, cool, relaxed around them, kind of like with your buddies or something. So I personally, it's just like an aside comment. I don't ever ask for anybody's photos or anything like that.
Yeah.
I once upon a time was into that, but we're talking like years ago. But yeah, I realized like you can't be their friend, or you can't like really get to know them if you want to like take something from them.
Yes. Yeah. It would be hard. And people have different attractions to being a celebrity. I remember Bob Arum, the boxing promoter, was speaking about Sugar Ray Leonard and Marvin Hagler when those guys were going to fight in the 80s. And Arum said that Ray Leonard likes to be the center of attention. He likes to be out in the public and people clamoring to want to be close to him and that. And he said Hagler was different. Hagler wants to be the best boxer in the world, but when he goes to a restaurant to eat, he wants no one to notice him and just to be left alone so he could have dinner with his wife or whatever. There's people have different or celebrities have different relationship to their celebrity.
Yeah. And a lot of times I think celebrities and just like the people who are kind of chasing them, they confuse what love and affection actually is. Because a lot of times, well, it depends on, of course, the person, right? So if, like, let's say a musician or a poet or a writer has touched you in some profound way and you just wanted to sort of share that with them, I think that that's okay. But like when it comes to, like, let's say Sylvester Stallone, and this is definitely not a knock on him, but the thing is, like, he's an actor, right? So we don't really know much about him. So the people who like love Sylvester Stallone, they don't love him. They love Rocky, they love Rambo, they love Cobra. Right? They're like, oh my God, remember that fight that you had with like Apollo Creed or whatever? Stallone was like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Exactly. Yeah. I agree with that. So it's different, like you said, with some writer or you're a poet who wrote this poem that you read once a month because it has such meaning to you. Then I think you do know something about that person. Right. And maybe you would like to share your affection for the person, but it's different for athletes or even you might just love boxing and love watching boxers, but you don't really know that person so much, and that's kind of a projection of itself.
Yeah, most definitely. So for me, at least, going back to the ideas, seems to be a big theme here of authenticity. That I think that like if a person, I don't obviously know, but my guess is that for a celebrity, if they were approached for that reason, to say like, well, like we had Napoleon of the Outlaws on, and so for me, like Napoleon was a really big part of my teenage years because like his music really touched me, and so him and Tupac and the rest of them, they were pretty much there for me at a period where I really needed them and I really identified with them, and so I feel like he's the type of person where, because of the stuff that he put out, where if you reached out to him and you tell him like, hey, like this is how you've affected my life, for him I think he really appreciates that. Whereas opposed to like, I don't know, maybe somebody again who's like an actor or I don't know, maybe some other kind of profession where they don't really put so much of themselves out there. Maybe for them it's like, well, you just want to you want to get a picture with me to sort of improve or increase your status, or you want to sell my autograph. Like athletes like usually dislike giving autographs because they know where those autographs are going. They're going right on eBay.
Right. So I think like what you're describing, the musician, you're not attracted to the musician's celebrity. You're attracted to to the artistry.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people just want to touch some celebrity, not the person, but the social image, and that's an entirely different matter, you know.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
All right, let me see what else. Oh, so Glenn, I also wanted to focus on your influences. So, who in your mind would you, in terms of when you were coming up in boxing, who were some of the people or the boxers who inspired you and who influenced you, and who were the kind of, I guess, the prototypes for you?
Well, I say my favorite boxer of all time was Joe Frazier,
Mm-hmm.
and so I envisioned myself as kind of a little white Joe Frazier when I was a kid,
Yeah.
and that was one of the illusions that had to be stripped from me, you know, because I realized I was not Joe Frazier in any way, shape, or form, you know. So you kind of got to develop your own type of fighting style. But there's um, a couple boxers. There's a guy named Jesse Burnett who fought from Southern California, who I guess if you just want to talk about style, who you look similar to in the ring, I kind of followed him for a bit. And then when I was younger, we didn't have access to videos and access to tapes to watch other boxers like we do now with YouTube and DVDs you could buy. But there's this an older guy named he's dead now, George Benton from Philadelphia, who was just an absolute artist. And so you could see some of his fights on YouTube, where you could buy DVDs of his, and he's just an absolute artist. And I could watch him now, and you know, in my little fantasy stages of my life, I just kind of envision moving like he did. And and then it's funny, long before I met Yaqui Lopez, he was, a world-renowned light heavyweight, and that's the weight class that I was in. And so I used to have these little dream of fighting him someday. And then, so it was really kind of a slap in the face, a real kind of shock to actually meet him, become his sparring partner. And once I began sparring with him, I realized that my dreams about how the fight would turn out if we had fought were different than what the real world would have been.
Yeah.
But so I like Yaqui a lot. So I watched him from, I think, about 1974. So even when I was still in high school. But guys like Joe Frazier, George Benton, Yaqui, this is, and not just the way they physically fought, but how they carried themselves in their approach to boxing, and how they carried themselves in their approach generally in life. And Yaqui still has an influence on me. I think I could say that probably he and my father are the two most influential men in my life. And so I told that to Yaqui. I hadn't seen him for years when I wrote this book, and I ran a copy down to him because I didn't want him to be surprised by anything that came out, and I let him know that he and my father were the two most influential people in my life, and it was important for me to say that to him.
How did he respond?
It meant quite a bit to him. Again, I say he's not going to bust out in tears and get all emotional, but I could see by his eyes that it meant an awful lot to him, which that was an important for me.
And how in particular did he influence you? Like, what were some of the most important things that you learned from him?
He was like the consummate professional to me. So he was always completely prepared for a boxing match. You hear today's about guys, they say they're not in shape or they're not making their weight. He was always completely prepared, and he had a very stoical attitude about boxing. He was very serious about the boxing itself, but once the fight was over, he didn't take himself seriously or the event too seriously. And like I said, what was important to him is that he committed himself fully to winning, and then he just let the chips fall where they may. And it didn't bother him that he won or lost as much as it would other people, although, he was basically out there willing to die in order to win. And it's just almost kind of a mystic. I mean, I don't want to, talk about him like he's saintly or anything, but he was almost kind of mystical in how he approached boxing, and it's just a good way to approach life as well. And and it funny in his name, his real name is Alvaro Lopez, and he got the
Oh,
name Yaqui Lopez when he was fighting as an amateur in Northern California. And I think his manager introduced him as an Indian
Mhm.
just to, to create some sense of notoriety. And then somebody said, "What tribe? What tribe?" And so the only thing his manager could think of was Yaqui. So that's how that nickname stuck.
Yeah.
And but he did have kind of a mystical, extrasensory relationship to boxing. It was really really impressive to see.
Yeah.
And you don't come across, or so I've been around boxing for a long time. You don't come across very many people who have the attitude developed as strongly as he did.
Yeah. And what would you say is his or was, I guess, his formula for resilience? How did he do it?
Uh, well, some people are just born tougher than other people. So part of that, I think, in his case, was genetics.
Mm-hmm.
But the other part was that he trained so perfectly well. He was always in just top condition.
Yeah.
Would sometimes work out 2 or 3 days a week. I mean, 2 or 3 times a day,
Mm-hmm.
um, and was uh, and very very brave. So when he was younger, he had wanted to be a bullfighter. He lived in Mexico till he was 13, and he had this attraction to being a gladiator type of artist under harsh, physically dangerous circumstances. So before he became interested in boxing, he was attracted to bullfighting. So he just kind of had the stoical attitude about to activities like that.
Yeah. I wonder if in his mind he kind of viewed himself as being more than just a boxer or a gladiator.
Uh, I guess that was something I would have when I talked to him about some of the things we mentioned earlier. I think I'll try to bring that up because he would never bring that up on his own.
Mm-hmm.
I guarantee you. But maybe you could draw that out a little bit.
Yeah, maybe he had a good therapist.
no, he's an interesting guy. He would go full in into a fight, but then whatever the result is, he didn't take it personally. And
Yeah, I
then
think that's a good way of putting it.
yeah, so it's kind of like I like that you said he had a mystic way about him. That sounds like it's kind of like he didn't have like a kind of like an ego coming in. Like he would try his best, but he didn't let the result mess with who he thought he like how he thought of
You know,
himself.
Yeah.
that's exact. Well put. So he didn't have a false ego at all. There was nothing pretentious about his ego, and I think he understood himself very very well. So when we talk about authenticity, he was, I think, a very authentic human being from early in his adulthood. He understood himself very well, and he didn't identify himself with the hierarchy of boxing. He identified himself with how he invested himself in boxing, and the actual
Yes.
results were of lesser importance than
Yep. That's
in his
excellent.
in his engagement.
Yep. And
I
at the
think that's attraction. I think the attraction. It's his engagement to boxing that is so beautiful.
Yeah, and why, in my mind, that's such an excellent point is because Frankel pretty much said the same thing. So with Frankel and the way he kind of overcame the camps was by that. So for him, what was important to him was living up to his values. So, which is again, obviously, not to say that we can do that every single time, but what I find is that look, it's like the way, as I'm sure the both of you already know, because you've been alive for some time, that life is going to have its sort of its downfalls, right, or its sort of pitfalls. And the thing is, it's like the idea is, and I'm going to give you guys a Rocky quote again after this, but the idea is essentially from Frankel and sort of being an authentic person, it's just that it's pretty much that self-esteem or self-love can come from or stem from pretty much how well you ascribe, not how well you ascribe to, how well you live up to your values. So for Frankel, it was
Yes,
pretty, yeah.
yes,
So for Frankel, it was pretty much that if I can remain a human being, if I can remain as a person who is sort of committed to my ethics, then in a sense that I could feel like, okay, this is a terrible experience, but it's not one that has to debilitate and devastate me. So authenticity in that sense means literally living up to or as trying as best as you can to live up to your values. So if let's say your values are courage, resilience, fortitude, determination, let's say persistence, right? All of these things are still possible even within the context of failure. So one can say that here are the outcomes, right? But here's the fact that I lived up to, or at least to the best of my abilities, I lived up to those values that for me make up what I think is a lovable person. And so going back to Rocky and Rocky Balboa from 2006, he had this phenomenal quote, which I pretty much use over and over again and as much as I can, where there's this great scene with him and his son, and his son pretty much is, you know what I'm going to say, right? So his son is, kind of complaining about life, and he's like, oh, like, he's like, people don't respect me, and I'm like in your shadow, and they always think about you. And then Stallone says, he's like, that's what cowards say. He's like, he's like, pretty much when it comes to life, he's like, life isn't about how hard you can hit, right? Life is pretty much about how hard you can get hit, and then keep moving and keep getting up, right? It's pretty much that he says that winning is about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward and pretty much and keep getting up. So for him, life wasn't about how much you win or how much you lose or whether you fail or succeed. Yeah. It's pretty much how you keep moving forward, and it's about character and grit and resilience and how will you live up to those values that can, if you allow them to, pretty much conceptualize who you are as a human being.
Yes. So I wrote about this a little bit. It's kind of related to Hemingway. Mm-hmm. So Hemingway had this theory of what he called being undefeated, mm-hmm. whether you're a boxer or a bullfighter or anything in life. And so you could lose the contest and still remain undefeated because you yourself internally, you're not beating yourself. And so I contrasted that in my career when I ran, and then I went into my funk. I was the epitome of a defeated person, whereas Yaqui fought for the world championship 5 times and lost each of those 5 times, but he was never a defeated person. He might have lost the fight, but he was never defeated, just because of the values you mentioned, so because of his character and his understanding of what the context of the outcome of the fight was, and he knew the limitations of its importance. He was not beaten by being beaten. And that's a very, very important quality in life.
And is that how Hemingway saw it too?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's why he valued bullfighters, the best bullfighters and boxers, because that's how they lived. And you could lose without being beaten, but to allow yourself to be beaten is shameful. And I kind of agree with that. And so if you are broken by your failures, you have to find some way to rebuild yourself. And that's how you become an authentic human being.
Yeah. And I think that as long as you're living up to or trying to live up to your values, you can't be defeated.
Yeah. And that's what you were just describing as sort of the existential code in literary figures. You have those detectives like Raymond Chandler's Marlowe and guys like that. They have this code, and they're not going to violate their values no matter what happens to them. And that's a very impressive quality in a person.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, Glenn, I also wanted to ask, since you mentioned it before, because our kind of conversation took a more serious direction, I didn't want to really mention it, but now I really want to ask because it's like an itch. How come you didn't like the other Rocky movies?
I didn't see that coming.
So, well, I how many have there been? So I think I've only seen 4. I think I stopped after the 4th. So they.
So six Rockies and 2 Creeds.
Okay, I haven't seen the Creeds either.
Yes,
although I heard they're good.
So good.
All right. The first Rocky was very sincere, and I think a good representation of like the inner boxer, so to speak. But after that, they just kind of seemed to be clones of the first Rocky. I was less attracted to him. Yeah. So the second one was that Clubber. Yeah, the second one was a rematch, and there was Clubber Lane. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the second one was him and Apollo again, and then the third one was Clubber Lane.
And I talk about Rocky a lot. I think I've got a line in the book. I said, for someone who says he doesn't like the Rocky movies a lot, I sure seem to reference them quite a bit. So I realize they've had an impact on me. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What did you think of the 4th one?
Is that Drago. With Drago?
Yeah.
I think I like that the least. I think that's why I stopped.
That's so funny because that's considered like one of the best ones, if not the best one by some people.
Is that so?
Yeah. Oh my God. Rocky IV is it's considered like to be one of the better ones. Yeah.
Maybe I'll have to readjust my thinking. I'll go back and watch them sometime.
No, I'm actually with you, Glenn. I like the first Rocky. I like the 4th. I'm fine with the 4th one, but it wasn't like the best one.
No, it wasn't the best. Okay, yeah. No, most definitely. It wasn't the best one, but I thought it was really good. I mean, and
No,
Different strokes, different folks.
you know what's interesting? So people hate Rocky Five. I actually loved it, and so and I always whenever I mention this, people always like give me the side eye. They're like, "What?" So here's the thing: the story itself, it could have been better, and Stallone like also disliked Rocky Five. But what I really liked about the story is that it wasn't like so with Rocky Four, it was pretty much glitz and glamour. You know, it was about kind of the crowd fair. And it was pretty much two different worldviews against one another. Whereas Rocky Five became a personal story because he actually lost everything he had. So in the movie, like Paulie ends up, I don't remember exactly what happened, but Paulie gives their accountant like power of attorney, and then so their accountant invests like a good sum of their savings, like in some sort of fraud or whatever it was, some sort of fraudulent scheme, and then so what happens is they pretty much lose everything. And so Rocky has to go back to Philadelphia, and then he lives with Paulie in like his old house, and then essentially so he has like this really sort of terrible moment where he's like, I can't believe it, I'm just another part of the neighborhood. He's like, whether they achieved all of that for nothing, right, just to come back here. And so he has this deep existential crisis. And so I don't know, maybe it's not as entertaining for most people as like, you know, kind of the bigger fights on like the bigger stages. But the thing is, I think from the perspective of a Rocky story, what was so cool about it is that it started out initially where it was sort of the rise to fame, right, where he was kind of like, you know, this sort of desolate guy who really didn't have much going for him. But then it sort of went back to those humble beginnings where now he had to figure out what to do with his life now that he lost everything. And so I don't know, I just thought it was a cool story.
so that was 5.
Yeah, so he fought Tommy Gunn in that one.
Okay, I'll watch that one.
Okay.
I'll watch that. I'll get back to you. I'll watch it and get back to you.
Yeah, I would really be curious as to what you think. And definitely the Creed movies, too. Those were excellent.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there have been 2 of those,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm. So the
Okay.
second one
Right.
is where he fights Drago's son.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
All right.
And they
All right.
actually
So you
brought...
gotta see all the.
And they brought back, I think his name is Dolph Langdon? Or Landon?
Lundgren?
That's
Dolph
his name?
Lundgren?
Lundgren? Yeah, so
Yeah,
they
yeah.
brought him back for the second Creed movie. So, and this scene is incredible, because, like, he's just staring at, like, so he's in Rocky's restaurant, and he's staring at a bunch of these old photos, and Rocky walks in, and he's like, what the hell are you doing here? He's like, I haven't seen you in, like, 30 years.
Oh, no. All right. So, okay. So I've heard that the guy who directed Creed
Uh-huh.
is I can't remember his name. I think he lives in. Well, he probably doesn't live in Oakland anymore.
Mhm.
But he made a good movie about Oakland, about the shooting at the transit station
Yes.
in Oakland, and he went to college here in Sacramento at Sac State.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little local connection to that.
Yeah, and Michael B. Jordan was the actor in that movie. So before they
Yeah.
did Creed, yeah, that's how they linked up. And I guess somewhere down the line, they're like, oh, let's make him Apollo Creed's son.
Oh my gosh! All right.
Yeah, Glenn. I feel bad. I wanted to ask. Actually, did we pass over anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't bring up?
No, I think what we concentrated on was kind of the essence of the book that I was writing. So it's a lot about boxing, but I think I can honestly say it's not a book about boxing, although there's a lot of boxing in it. It's about how a person becomes broken and then reassembles himself, which is kind of what your podcast here is about in your work. So that's why I was kind of interested in talking to you guys, because it's kind of a book of personal philosophical development. That's what it is, and I think we covered that pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah, like anyone who would check out the book or listen to this interview, this is a tremendous amount of value here. I mean, especially there's so many people who have don't have the best circumstances happen in their life, and that's a lot of people. A lot of people could relate to that, and they don't know how to come out of that, how to build themselves back up, or how to kind of overcome it. You know,
Yep.
a lot of people also are lucky enough to not have experienced a lot of obstacles,
Yeah.
so they don't have to worry about things like this. But for the people who do, this is a tremendous value. There's so many more people like that than you would think. Yeah. So.
Thank you for saying that, and that's true. You know, because you could look at me. I grew up in a pretty stable household, pretty loving parents, with a lot of structure and some guidance to go do something in life. And then I went and took a detour from my family plan. So from any external view, I've had a really comfortable life, and that's true. But you could still be from the external view doing pretty well and be struggling on the inside
Yeah.
seriously. And so that's what I've come to realize, that you can't know anybody's story really just from looking at them. They sometimes there's a whole world going on inside their head that you have no idea about. And once you go through a little period, I guess you become some type of wounded healer. Then you could understand or empathize with other people's struggles because you realize they're somewhat similar to your own.
Yeah, I love the Rollo May quote. Yep. The
Yes,
wounded,
yes.
yeah, and Kirk mentioned that last week.
Yeah,
too.
that's what I was just thinking. Like, we literally were talking about this last week.
Yeah, the wounded healer concept.
Wow.
So amazing how everything is sort of tied in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of connections here. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Glenn, thank you so much for coming on again. I thought this was a really powerful discussion.
Thank you, man. I really, really appreciate it. I'm glad to talk to you guys and meet you, so to speak, here.
Yeah, most
definitely. It's been great.
Same
Absolutely.
here.
And guys, remember, the book is called Punching from the Shadows, memoir of a minor league professional boxer. If you want to find it, you can find it on YouTube and not YouTube. I'm so sorry. on Amazon.com. Yeah. And Glenn, if let's say somebody wanted to follow you on Twitter, what's your Twitter handle?
I have to look. I don't even know.
If I had to guess, yeah, go ahead. Glen Sharp, I think, at Glen Sharp.
Yeah, I think it's at Glen Sharp 33. Let me see.
Yep, at Glen Sharp.
Glen Sharp
33.
33. I'm sorry. I don't even know my own head off.
No, actually, that's a lesson for the future. Like, we should just have
have it out. Well, Glenn, are you on social media anywhere else, or is just Twitter?
So I'm on Facebook, but I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook. I think I've kind of used that to connect with old high school friends for the most part. Okay. So I spend most of my time on Twitter.
Okay, so Twitter is the place to find you.
Yes.
All right, Glenn. Thank you so much.
That's right. And if anyone has any questions, I usually try to answer. If someone has some thoughts or questions about the book or anything, I try to interact pretty well.
Oh,
okay, cool.
Okay.
Cool. All right, so shoot Glenn a message if you. Yeah.
And, yeah, most definitely. And Glenn, any final thoughts or comments for our audience before we go?
No, I just want to thank you guys. I appreciate your thoughts about the book, and I'm very thankful to get to talk to you guys.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
Thanks, Glenn.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Wow.
All right, guys.
Wow, that was cool.
Yeah, such a good show, man.
I can't believe I thought that I got the Joe Louis thing wrong.
Yeah, well, then I got it wrong.
But that's okay. Well, anyway, guys, if you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Remember to like and subscribe.
Hit the bell.
Hit the bell. I want to
and leave some comments, guys. Like, we'll pretty much answer as many of them as we possibly can. And we want to know what your thoughts are. Grit, resilience, pretty much what makes up self-esteem, and how a person themselves can come to an area of self-acceptance or self-love.
Absolutely. And see you guys next week.